Good.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. She's a very special guest speaker from my point of view and from many points of view in our department. Emily Osborne, Dr. Emily Osborne, is a NOAA marine biochemist with the Ocean Chemistry and Ecosystem Division of the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory, located in Miami, Florida. She uses a combination of paleoceanographic archives and modern ocean observations to study natural and human-induced ocean changes. After graduating from the Department of Geology here at College of Charleston with a BS in 2012, Emily studied at the University of South Carolina under the mentorship of my PhD advisor, Dr. Bob Thinnell, where she earned her PhD in marine science. And I'll interject here that I was Bob's first PhD and Emily was his last. So we were bookends to Bob's very illustrious career. Emily's dissertation involved developing proxy techniques using the marine fossil record to study the progression of ocean acidification along the US West Coast, looking at over the last century of data. Let's see, after her PhD, she got an extremely prestigious Marine Science Policy Fellowship called the Knauss Fellowship, where she was located in Washington, D.C. and worked at NOAA headquarters for the Arctic Research Program. She then became a full-time member, an employee of NOAA, and has worked for the Climate Program Office, the Global Oceans Monitoring and Observing Program, and the Ocean Acidification Program. And again, she is now located in Miami, Florida. And Emily, it's so great to have you. I remember from the very first geology, what is now 105 lab, that you were seated in my lab and you sat next to your very special friend, Tim, who later became your husband, and you met him in my lab. So I take full credit for that relationship, as well as for your illustrious career, you know, of course. So welcome, and I'm so glad you could come. And next time we're going to make sure you get here in person.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. Doc really hit the nail on the head. CFC was a really important part of my career trajectory, and it feels wonderful to be back here with you and presenting on some of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years since I've graduated from the College of Charleston. So I can't see you guys right now as I'm presenting my screen. So please just give me a holler if you have any questions or you want to have me pause and explain something in a little bit more detail. I'm happy to keep this informal. I had entirely too many slides when I initially made my presentation. I hoped that I pared it down enough to reserve plenty of time for us to chat at the end. So today I'm going to be talking about several different lines of work that I've done over the course of my dissertation and also time at NOAA. These have involved looking at developing paleoclimate records, but also using more recently modern oceanography to kind of pair modern observations with paleoclimate records to truly understand the impact that we've had as humans on our oceans and on our climate. So Doc went over a few of these details, but I would like to just kind of quickly jog through a little bit of my career path, since this is an undergraduate seminar, and I really want to encourage you, if you have any questions about what it's like to work at NOAA or want to chat about kind of career directions or anything that I say piques your interest today, please feel free to reach out. My email's in the slide here, and I'm sure Doc would be happy to put you in touch with me as well. But I came to the College of Charleston in 2008. And I declared as a geology major right off the bat. As Doc said, I met my husband, my now husband, in her geology class my first year at the College of Charleston. My second year was marked by this amazing opportunity to participate in the Transects program, which allowed me to go to sea for the very first time. As an undergraduate at the College of Charleston, I really didn't realize how amazing the opportunities were that were being offered by the department that you're a part of to get out into the field and get your hands dirty and really kind of get a sense of what gets you excited with respect to science. So going to sea, as a part of the Transect program, we were able to do a number of different operations, including just basic CTD casts, bottom trawls, mock nests, net deployments, and also, most importantly to me, sediment grabs. And so it was on this Transect cruise, my second year as a geology student at the college, that I was able to look at my first marine sediments and play in mud and look at microfossils, specifically foraminifera, which I'll talk about at length today. And that was kind of my first entrance into paleoclimate research and how we can use the fossil record on the seafloor to understand our Earth's past. So from there, as Doc mentioned, I followed in her footsteps and went to the University of South Carolina, working under the advisement of Bob Thinnell, and began working more with planktonic foraminifera. So these are microorganisms that live within the surface of the ocean, and looking at their shells, both kind of their morphologies or the shapes of the shells, in addition to their geochemistries, to develop tools in order to really understand ocean acidification. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the most recent chapter of my career, as Doc mentioned, I got to participate in the Sea Grant Knauss Fellowship in 2017. It's a year-long position that brings anywhere from 50 to 70 fellows. You can see in the bottom right, that is my cohort in 2017. To the Washington, D.C. area, there are fellows that work on Capitol Hill, and there are fellows that work at federal agency headquarter offices. There are even fellows that work at the White House. It's a really incredible experience to kind of sit in the space in between research and where policy is made. And so it was a really exciting opportunity for me to kind of connect those two areas of interest in terms of loving to conduct science, but also wanting to affect positive policy change in the world around me. And as a part of that, I was able to go to Capitol Hill, provide briefs. This is a photo of me outside of Senator Feinstein's office. She's the senior senator for California, where I was invited to brief her staff on ocean acidification off the West Coast, and have just had amazing opportunities to go into the field and do really cool work that's aligned with the NOAA mission. So happy to chat with anyone about what it's like to work at NOAA and educational opportunities that can help you kind of get your foot in the door with the agency. So when Doc first contacted me about providing the seminar, it was my understanding that the seminar series is really focused, or at least in part inspired by the recent release of the Ipcc Ar6 report from Working Group 1 on the physical science basis. And so today I have kind of several chapters of my talk that I'll talk about, different things that I've done with respect to my research, and I'm framing each of those chapters in terms of some of the headlines that came out in the Ipcc Ar6 report. So I'm sure all of you are super familiar. This Ipcc report was produced by an author team of nearly 250 individuals spanning 65 countries. This year, at present, women represent just about a quarter of the authorship, but that number is continuing to grow, and Ipcc is really making a concerted effort to bring in new voices and new authors every year. So as your career progresses, keep an eye out for opportunities to serve as a reviewer and learn about the Ipcc process. I've found that working on climate assessments has been incredibly rewarding. And this is something that's definitely within reach of all of you if it's something that piques your interest. So as I mentioned, there's kind of a few different flavors that I'm going to walk through in terms of the research that I've been conducting. And so I'll keep kind of all of these projects at a somewhat of a high level. If you have any questions, feel free to come off mute or just shout out in the room that you're in, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about them. But first, I'm going to be talking about records of Arctic change and work that I did with the Arctic Research Program my first couple of years at NOAA. Then I'm going to talk about my paleoceanography work developing ocean acidification records, specifically within the California current ecosystem. And then last, I'm going to wrap up talking a little bit about most recently the work that I've been doing at the lab that I work at here in Miami. So to kick off our Arctic chapter, every year NOAA has published a report called the Arctic Report Card. And the report card comes out at the end of the year. So we are just shy of getting to talk about the headlines coming out of the 2021 Arctic Report Card. The report card is released every year at the AGU fall meeting. So if any of you are planning to be at AGU virtually or in person, check out the press release for the Arctic Report Card. It's about an hour. You'll hear the head of the agency talk about the findings of this report. So every year we are coming together and looking at how has the Arctic environment changed over the last calendar year. And so far, NOAA has released a total of 15 Arctic report cards on an annual basis. So I'm going to be talking about the findings that have been released almost a year ago to date for the NOAA 2020 Arctic report card, reflecting on 15 years of change. Every year, the Arctic Report Card reports on a series of what we call vital signs. And these vital signs are climate indicators of what the state of the climate in the Arctic is like. These vital signs are reported on an annual basis because they are easy to collect these observations and analyze them on an annual basis. These are all measurements that can be made by satellite observations. And so we have a consistent 15-year record of all of these variables, these vital signs that are listed here. With that being said, every year we also cycle in guest essays that are featured on data sets that take more than a year to collect. For example, a lot of biology related work. I was able to contribute an essay on paleoclimate perspectives, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. And an exciting addition to some of the guest essays is every year for the last 2, now 3 years, we've invited Indigenous community members from the Arctic to provide an essay and talk about their unique experience in experiencing Arctic change that's happening around them. And so just to kind of run through some of the findings that came from this Arctic report card, I'll talk in the next few slides in greater detail about surface air temperature and sea ice extent. But we also reported in 2020 that there was mean sea surface temperatures were 1 to 3 degrees warmer than they have been across the 1982 to 2010 climatology. That's a range of years that we take the average of in order to really understand how things have changed in relation to kind of a more stable period of time. We've also seen that in conjunction with our sea surface temperature anomalies warming, that ocean primary productivity is also stably increasing in some areas of the Arctic in 2020 during the summertime. Primary productivity was 6 times higher than it has been in the past. The reason we have bowheads featured on this front page is because the Indigenous community supported essay that was featured in the 2020 report card talked about the increase that they've seen in bowhead whales within the Arctic environment. This is a positive story for these communities that hunt these whales and use them as a main source of food on an ongoing basis. The increase in the bowhead population, specifically on the Pacific Arctic side of the basin, is likely a direct result of warming sea surface temperatures, an increase in primary productivity, and also influx of kind of the low trophic zooplankton that they consume within this part of the ocean that just simply wasn't there because it's an environment that's warming and changing really dramatically. So we're also seeing a shift in the Greenland ice sheet, so a long-term decline in the Greenland ice sheet, as well as tundra greenness. We're seeing that the Arctic is browning, it's drying out. We're seeing a huge increase in wildfire prevalence across the Arctic, which is also contributing to CO2 emissions. And kind of there are so many different interesting climate feedbacks that are interacting and working together to just drive massive changes across the Arctic environment. So this is a figure that I liked from the 2020 Arctic Report Card because it puts into context how many years the report card has been reporting on Arctic variables. So in 2006 was the first year that the report card was released. This is a figure showing north of, excuse me, so the gray line is our atmospheric temperature anomaly across the entire globe. And so we can see this long-term warming trend from the year 1900 when this record begins all the way to present. What's interesting about this particular figure is that it also includes the anomaly for the Arctic, and that is surface air temperatures north of 60 degrees. And what you can see is that right around the year 2000 and thereafter, there's a divergence between the Arctic air temperature anomaly and the global air temperature anomaly. And in fact, the Arctic during this period of time is warming at twice the rate as the rest of the globe. This is a phenomenon that's been termed Arctic amplification because of those number of different climate feedbacks that I was referring to on the previous slide that are interacting and causing just massive changes within the Arctic region. So we have melting of ice and a change in albedo, or the kind of percent of sun energy that's reflected back. It's instead being absorbed by the Arctic environment. This includes loss of sea ice, and an exposure of a dark ocean surface, which is also absorbing more heat, which is increasing sea surface temperature, which is promoting ice melt. So it's just a number of variables that come together and cause the Arctic to really have this runaway warming effect that we've seen over the last decade or so. So the Ipcc Ar6 report came out and said that it's virtually certain that the Arctic will continue to warm more than global surface temperatures, with a high confidence that it will be warming 2 times the rate of global warming. So we're expecting to see this trend that emerged around the year 2000 to continue and perhaps even intensify. So the 2020 report card also reported that it was the second warmest year on record, with 2016 being the warmest year on record. And this is a continuation of a pattern. 9 of the last 10 years were the warmest years on record, and surface air temperature anomalies are continuing to warm. We see that over specifically the Eurasian Arctic, and during 2020, we had temperature anomalies that were all the way 4.5 degrees Celsius, 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than usual. So really dramatic temperature changes occurring in our far north. So next, another vital sign that typically gets a lot of attention is a metric that we report, which is the extent of summer sea ice across the Arctic. So it's very normal for the extent of sea ice across the Arctic Ocean. For those of you who might not think about the Arctic too much, or have kind of taken a dive into what goes on up at the North Pole, there is a natural seasonal fluctuation, a massive seasonal fluctuation in sea ice coverage across our northern hemisphere, where 2/3 of the ice melts seasonally and grows back. So what we're looking at here is the extent of sea ice at the sea ice minimum, which occurs in September every year at the end of summertime. And the yellow line shows the median extent for the years 1981 to 2010. Again, that's a climatology that we use as a reference point. And you can see that there's been a vast decline in the extent of our summertime sea ice. And another reason why this is important is because we're seeing a major reduction in what we call multi-year ice. So the sea ice that is able to persist through the summertime and then regrow within the next season. Multi-year ice is inherently thicker ice, more robust ice. It's more resistant to melt. And so as we're seeing a declining fraction of multi-year ice making up our ice extent in the Arctic, we're seeing that the ice melt that is there is more prone to melting. Again, another positive feedback to loss of sea ice in the Arctic. So the Ipcc also came out with a statement regarding the likelihood of there being a September, which is, again, when we have this sea ice minimum, where the Arctic is virtually ice-free. And so there are several scenarios, specifically 4.5, 7.0, and 8.5, where you can see that there's a high degree of likelihood that we will have near ice-free Septembers in the Arctic in the future, unless we're able to curb our atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So taking a turn a little bit further back in time. So I had mentioned when I came on to NOAA in 2017 during my fellowship year, I had the privilege of working with the Arctic program and working on the Arctic report card for the very first time. And I was able to contribute a guest essay on a topic they had never featured before, which was Paleoceanographic perspectives on Arctic ocean change. And the rationale between this is that we have these modern observational records. At best, for our satellite records, they go back until the 80s. For some of our temperature records, we're fortunate to have data back into the early 1900s. But beyond that, we really don't have data that can, modern observational kind of direct data that can provide us a context of the rate and magnitude of change that we're seeing in different variables across the Arctic environment. So as a part of my contribution, I synthesized a number of records and manuscripts that had been published on paleoclimate work across the Arctic region. This is a figure here showing the different sediment core records that I compiled to kind of pull together what ultimately is a short 3-page essay summarizing what we know about paleoclimate in the Arctic to date. And the real point of the Arctic report card is that it's written in a way that it's generally accessible to a broad audience. And so we want to use this as a communication tool to help folks understand the importance and kind of the dire changes that are happening across the Arctic environment. So I feel like I'm already running over time. So I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these a little bit quickly. So this is a figure from the essay that I contributed, which is a global compilation, so not Arctic specific, of benthic foraminifera records, which are used to determine global temperature anomalies. So this is the wiggly record at the very bottom. And then the upper light blue dots are proxy data that have, is a global compilation of proxy data that are estimates of atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And so what we can see over the last 60,000 years is there's been a shift from a warm greenhouse climate into what we call an icehouse climate with a lot of variability over kind of the more recent, if you will, geologic past. We have a couple of major data points here that were incorporated through Arctic down core studies. So we see the first evidence of Arctic sea ice back in the Eocene. This was seasonal sea ice, so we didn't have ice persistent or multi-year ice throughout the year. This was indicated by the presence of a diatom shell, a fossil diatom shell within the sediment records. These particular species of diatom are ice obligate, meaning that they only live in association with sea ice. So the presence of those diatoms was the first indicator of ice ever within the Arctic environment. And then as we move through time into the Miocene, there was a sediment record from the Central Arctic, which picked up ice rafted debris signals, or IRD, and matched the mineralogy of those IRD within the sediment cores to the coastal margins, and deduced that this was the rise of perennial or multi-year sea ice that existed within the Arctic. And so zooming in, if we're looking down here at our x-axis, we can look at calendar years. So we have all the way up here at the year 2000 at modern, and we're spanning back to around the year 500. And what we see here in the upper panel is our atmospheric CO2 record. This is from an ice core spliced together with our Mauna Loa observations, which are collected in situ and in real time and analyzed. And we're comparing this CO2 record with temperature anomalies from the Arctic atmospheric proxy records. This is a compilation of proxy records for Arctic temperatures And then in the gray here, we have a proxy record of sea surface temperature from planktonic foraminifera. So we see pretty consistent temperatures in both the ocean and within the atmosphere, and a spike that coincides with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And the same is true for this lower record here. This is a sea ice extent, a summer sea ice extent record, which is again a multi-proxy compilation. So this is derived from ice core air bubble characteristics that are helpful to determine water vapor content, temperature, also thickness of lake varve sediments and thickness from tree ring cores, which were all kind of melded together into a statistical analysis to estimate sea ice extent. And so this is a unique record that shows how sea ice extent has varied over time in relation to temperature and atmospheric CO2. And you see that the bottom really falls out here with respect to sea ice decline. So the Ipcc also came out and reported in the AR6 that Arctic sea ice extent is at the lowest level that it has been in 1,000 years at least, with a medium level of confidence associated with that statement. So quick shift, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about paleo records that I have been using to track the progression of another CO2 problem, which is ocean acidification. So this is the phenomena associated with increases in atmospheric CO2 coinciding with increases in CO2 within the surface of our oceans, and associated changes that happen to seawater carbonate chemistry that ultimately cause the pH of the ocean to drop down. And so we've been observing this phenomena in the global ocean for a couple of decades now. And this here is a figure from the Ipcc Ar6 report that shows the anticipated progression of ocean acidification into the future, with scenario 8.5 being quite a dire scenario where we see a net decline in pH of almost half a unit, which would be absolutely devastating to marine ecosystems, and particularly marine calcifiers that depend on ocean chemistry in its more basic form in order to build their shells and skeletons. So things like corals and shellfish are particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification, but more research is beginning to show that even organisms like finfish and whales may also be affected by acidification in a range of different ways. And so I'm going to skip this slide just for the sake of time. So this here is showing, again, kind of just a breakdown of what is ocean acidification. We've been observing atmospheric CO2 concentrations in Mauna Loa since the 1950s, and more recently in the 1980s or early 90s, researchers began going out into the ocean in proximity to the Mauna Loa Observatory and started collecting seawater samples to look at what was the chemistry of the seawater. And it emerged that we are in fact also seeing an increase in seawater CO2 concentrations and a coincident decline in seawater pH. And so this here is showing the kind of frame of time that we have direct observations globally of ocean acidification. And we have this huge observational gap, which I'm just showing back to the year 1900, but it's also before that, where we don't have any sort of record here to understand what's the progression of ocean acidification. And so a strong motivation of mine when I was conducting my PhD research was to fill in this gap here with some sort of high resolution record to understand how has pH varied over this interval of time so that we can better predict how pH will vary into the future. And so this was published a couple of years ago in an article, and this research was all focused on understanding the progression of ocean acidification, specifically within the California current ecosystem. This is a highly productive ecosystem dependent on shell fisheries, and fisheries economies on the West Coast are threatened by the progression of ocean acidification here. There's also a natural upwelling kind of system that exists off of the West Coast. So not only do we have atmospheric CO2 coming down from the surface, from anthropogenic sources, but we also have old waters that have a lot of respired carbon in them that are being upwelled and introduced to the surface of the ocean. So we have kind of a multi-stressor situation where ocean acidification is a very acute issue along the coast of California. So I was using, I've mentioned before, planktonic foraminifera and their fossil shells in order to understand the progression of ocean acidification. So this is a photo that I took of a live planktonic foraminifera. When this organism dies, which right now it's nomming on a shrimp, when this organism dies, what remains is this dark kind of sphere in the middle. This is a particular species that is always spherical. These organisms come in different sizes and shapes, but the sphere is a calcium carbonate shell, which when the organism dies, the shell sinks to the sea floor. It's preserved in the fossil record, and then people like me go and dig them up and look at them and try to understand what the conditions were like when they were alive and living specifically within the surface ocean. So there were some studies that had shown that there was likely an effect of carbonate ion concentration, which is a metric that's related to ocean pH and related to ocean acidification, and the weight of these shells. It was kind of an accidental finding. And so this kind of hatched a whole new field of research where folks started looking at what we call morphometrics, or the different kind of shell shape and size dynamics and what that might mean for the environment that they grew in. So there were a few studies that had looked at shell weight and its relation to atmospheric CO2 concentration and carbonate ion concentration, which again is something that's directly related to seawater pH. And we see this positive relationship emerging. And this is because these shelled organisms, these marine calcifiers, they use carbonate ions that are dissolved in seawater to build their shells. So when pH is higher, there's more of these building blocks these organisms are able to take up and build their shells. And so they're thicker, they're heavier. And so shell weight, very simply, can be used as a proxy for the carbonate ion concentration in which this organism lived. And so this is very oversimplified. It took me years to do this, but this is a relationship that I derived using forams that were collected over the course of my PhD. So I knew exactly when they lived and where they lived and what the ocean chemistry was like around them when they were living. And so I could relate carbonate ion concentration to shell weight, which we termed most complicatedly area density. And so essentially what we're able to do is, if we have a fossil shell in the sediment record that we know is well preserved, we can look at its shell thickness or area density, and we can back out, using this linear regression, what was the carbonate ion concentration when that organism was alive. So you can see here on the left panel, or on the right panel, at the upper end of this calibration where we have higher carbonate ion concentration, these shells, this is actually a cross section of a shell from this sample, are much thicker than the shells that are at the lower end of the calibration. And so we physically use just something so simple as a fossil shell thickness to track the progression of ocean acidification. And so what we saw, just very basically thinking about the morphometrics, we saw bigger shells because these are individuals that are happy because it's warmer, they're growing larger shells. But we see a significant decline in their area density or their shell wall thickness over the course of this sediment core record, which spanned from the year 1900 to the year 2000. And so what we saw was that this species of foram living off the coast of California over the last century was producing shells that were 20% thinner and 7% larger. So when we took that calibration relationship that I showed you a couple of slides ago, when we backed out, we took our shell thicknesses and backed out and estimated our carbonate ion concentration, this is what emerged. And so we see a 35% decline in surface ocean carbonate ion concentration over the 20th century. And we also, that equates to what we estimate as being a 0.2 unit decline in pH in this region, exceeding what was estimated as the global average of 0.1 units by more than a factor of 2. So that stressor of having anthropogenic atmospheric CO2, as well as just a lot of carbon within old seawater that is being upwelled along the coast of California, really makes this a region that has experienced just a rapid decline in acidification over the last century. And so there are some wiggles that you see around this long-term trend. I unfortunately don't have time to talk about those today, but I took a dive into kind of trying to figure out what those actually were, and another really interesting story emerged from that. So I'm just going to skip these slides. And so I wanted to take, again, when I was introducing this project, I was saying I want to understand the past so that I can better understand the future. And so from there, I took the record that I had generated and kind of pushed it forward based on different climate scenarios put forward by the Ipcc, and created these trajectories that just really kind of drive the point home of it's really up to us and our decision with respect to the CO2 emission scenario and how ocean acidification progresses across our global ocean. So it's very much within our reach to slow or stop the progression of ocean acidification. Stopping is very unlikely just because of policy and that we simply won't be able to just fully stop emitting carbon. But there's a huge range of what the outcome can be, and it's very much dependent on our decisions in consuming fossil fuels. So in just the last couple of slides, I'm going to spend just a tad bit of time talking about the next steps that I've taken, more in the direction of building out modern observations across the global ocean in order to track these variables, such as understanding how our oceans are warming and how oxygen is declining and how pH is declining. We don't have a great understanding of this on a global scale, specifically with respect to, for example, ocean acidification. We only have observations of ocean pH that are taken from ships that go out into the ocean, and those ships collect very valuable data sets, but they're often they're not able to cover the entire surface of the globe, and they're not able to do it on a spatial or temporal scale that would really allow us to understand how ocean biogeochemistry is changing. And so I'm now working on a project which is deploying what we call biogeochemical Argo floats. And these floats are these just amazingly engineered instruments which we throw in the ocean. They live out there for 5 years, and they collect all sorts of variables for us. They sink through the upper 2,000 meters of the water column, and they have this kind of ability to adjust their buoyancy so that they can ascend and descend through the water column and collect these measurements. They're often programmed to drift idly for 10 days before they collect a profile. So we get data every 10 days or so, although you can change this. So the sensors on the float begin to make measurements as the float is ascending to the surface. So it's measuring temperature, oxygen, chlorophyll, particulate concentrations, nitrates, salinity, ocean pH, in addition to pressure, so that we can relate all of those things to ocean depth. And then once it reaches the surface, it transmits all of that data in real time via a global satellite array. And it comes to people like me working on understanding and analyzing the data that's coming to us across the global ocean as I'm just able to sit at my desk at home. So it's a really incredible program. It's built on the backbone of the Argo program, which has been around since the 1990s. The Argo floats have traditionally only measured temperature and salinity, and they've been hugely instrumental in helping us to understand the ocean's role in climate, ocean heat content uptake, and just ocean warming in general. And so now we're taking these Argo floats that have measured temperature and salinity and building them out with all of these other sensors so that we can monitor ocean biogeochemistry. And so I mentioned that these floats have a battery, they're battery operated, and they are designed to collect 250 profiles as long as everything goes according to plan. So they can live out in the ocean for up to 6.5 years if they're sampling on a 10-day interval. So it's a pretty incredible tool. I was just able to go out into the Gulf of Mexico and deploy 4 of my own biogeochemical Argo floats. We have a small pilot array observing in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is just a quick kind of flash of all the data that we've been able to collect since the floats were first put into the water just about a month ago in October. This is the location of all the profiles that we've been getting back from them. So these will be super critical tools for us to really build out our open ocean observations, kind of measure how variables such as warming and deoxygenation and ocean acidification are varying across the global ocean. Whew. And these data sets will be really important to us creating stronger justification, rationale, and data sets to provide to policymakers to just hopefully affect positive change with respect to climate policy and changes that will happen in hopefully the very near future. And so with that, I'm going to take a breath and thank you for your attention and see if you all have any questions.
Well, I'll pop. That's all right. Teddy, okay if I say something?
Yeah, and then we have a question.
Oh, good. Go for it.
Okay. Oh, okay. Can I make it?
Yeah, you ask and then I'll repeat.
So those floaters,
The Argos.
did they use like the concept of biomimicry when creating those, because it kind of uses the same like concept of buoyancy that sea turtles use?
So do the Argo floats kind of mirror, or were they designed with biomimicry? Because they remind the student of sea turtles as they go up and down.
If they were designed with biomimicry, I've actually never heard
if that in mind.
I don't know. I don't think so. I was just a babe when the first Argo float was being designed, so I'm not quite sure what the inspiration was. That's a much nicer comparison. I usually, when I describe them, I'm like, they look like giant helium tanks. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't quite know the answer to that one.
Yeah, it's kind of like a swim bladder in a sense.
Yeah.
Probably in some capacity. Any other questions in the audience? Not yet. Leslie, did you have something?
Emily, thanks so much. It's great to see your work, of course. When you were talking about the data from the California current, you were showing that amazing, very high resolution data from going back in real small time slices. And I'm not sure you mentioned where that comes from and how those sediments are so unique that we can't do that kind of time series resolution elsewhere. And I just thought it would be important to mention how that happens, how you can do that there.
That is a great point. I did not talk about how marvelous of a study region the Santa Barbara Basin is. So the Santa Barbara Basin has been the site of many, many paleoceanographic studies because it is such a unique depositional environment. It's essentially restricted from any open ocean communication. It's a deep kind of sill, so we have anoxia that exists within the bottom of the basin, and so that allows for, we don't have any critters that are bioturbating and mixing up our sediments, but also because I mentioned a couple of times the California current is an upwelling system. It's a highly productive system. So we have just huge blooms of productivity. We have terrigenous input coming from rivers. We're right along the coast. And so that means that we have just a lot of deposition in general within the Santa Barbara Basin. And so what that means is that I like to think of sediment records as like pages in a book. And in the Santa Barbara Basin, we can literally look at a core and see every single page representing not only the years, but the season. So we can see summer and wintertime varves within the Santa Barbara Basin. So it's just, it really is an incredible place to work, especially looking at sediment cores where you can get this incredible resolution to develop records like the one that I created. I don't know if I will ever have the privilege of working in a basin like that. When I transitioned to doing Arctic work, it was a harsh reality that the sedimentation rate in the deep basin is so low, as it is for any deep ocean basin. And on the continental shelves in the Arctic, it is just riddled with sea stars, and walrus are there eating stuff on the bottom. And so things are all mixed up and it's crazy. And so yeah, that was a great question. Thanks, Doc.
I had to ask it because you have some of the marine geology students present there, and we are just talking about these things right now in class. Thanks.
Another question.
So how does the shell thickness of the diatoms, how does that affect their survivability?
How does the shell thickness affect survivability is the question.
That's such a good question. So when this paper was published, I had the privilege of working with NOAA Communications, and they like really pumped out my paper to a lot of different media outlets. And so I had this really incredible opportunity to do a lot of interviews with different media outlets. And that was a question that came up a lot of, are we worried about forams going extinct? Are forams dying because of ocean acidification? And one thing that I always shared was that forams have been around for hundreds of millions of years. They've persisted throughout just an incredible amount of geologic change, although I have to say the magnitude and rate of change occurring at present is on a different scale. But the forams themselves are not exhibiting any sort of sign of stress. We're not seeing a decline in their abundance. We're just simply seeing them express a change in how they grow their shells. And that doesn't seem, at least on the surface of the analysis that I was doing, it did not seem to show any sort of stress indicators that they were struggling to live or kind of thrive in the normal, simple way that they live. But that's certainly not the case for other calcifiers like corals and shellfish, where we see super malformed shells and just kind of this major shift in energy allocation to shell growth away from metabolism or other kind of physiological activities where those organisms do exhibit more stress, but their forams are just super simple critters and they seem to be doing just fine. And that makes them a better tool for me to actually use them as just kind of a metric for tracking this change.
And Emily, while you're comparing foraminifera to corals, corals, of course, don't like it to get too warm either. What happens to planktonic foraminifera with the temperature changing in the water?
Right. And so when we think about how corals will be impacted by climate change, I today have been talking a lot about ocean acidification, but the number one stressor for corals is temperature. So it is temperature that will be the thing that unfortunately wipes out corals because they're releasing their zooxanthellae and there's a stress response and they just simply die off. But with forams, we actually see that they I have this tendency to like assign emotions. They seem happy to me because they get much larger. They have a response where their shells actually get much bigger when we see this increase in temperature. I don't know, Doc, if that's what you were referencing.
Yeah, I was also getting at that they just migrate. You know, they
can just move.
They don't actively migrate, but they just show up in the temperature, sea surface temperature areas where they are happy. If it's too hot, they are found where it's more their temperature.
Correct.
Yep, Adam.
Asking for me as well. On the Arctic environment, the higher anomalies that we see in terms of temperature variability, I'm wondering if you've seen any studies that compares between that self-propelling positive feedback between whether it's an energy balance that's affecting the global warming or it's a CO2 being.
So using the Arctic Ocean, and when you showed us the temperature anomalies that, you know, it's rising pretty rapidly relative to the global average, do you know of any other studies that look into this from other areas, perhaps?
Whether energy balance is really affecting the temperature
And
change versus CO2.
is it the energy balance that's affecting temperature change, or is it CO2? I suppose.
So yeah, I feel like that's like sort of with these complex climate systems, there's like a little bit of chicken and egg of like what's actually driving what, because everything's sort of interrelated and causing feedbacks with one another. With respect to, are there other parts of the world that are warming rapidly like the Arctic is? To my knowledge, no, not to the extent that the Arctic has diverged so dramatically from the global average. I'm sure on perhaps, you know, smaller scales, there might be some exceptions to what I'm describing. But when we think about like vast regions of the globe, like we're talking about north of 60 degrees latitude, no, the Arctic is unique in the sense that it is warming so much faster than any other large kind of spanning region across Earth.
And is this just due to albedo?
So Arctic amplification is something that the jury is still sort of out on because of this, I'm calling it chicken and egg question of what's driving what. Albedo is an incredibly large part of it because, I mean, it feeds into you know, warming of the atmosphere, warming of the ocean, and then that causes further declines in snow cover and sea ice cover. And so, yes, that is another big piece, but there are also changes in atmospheric circulation that are occurring because of this temperature gradient breakdown between the northern hemisphere, or sorry, north of 60 degrees and the mid-latitudes. So there's a number of variables that are changing all at the same time, and it's kind of difficult to nail down what exactly it is. I haven't read anything that kind of definitively says that this is the number one thing that's driving the phenomena of Arctic amplification, but albedo is certainly a really big part of it.
Any other questions from the audience? Just on the science, you know, if you have any personal questions too, she's open to answer those.
Yeah, happy to answer any questions you guys might have outside of the science too. If you think of one later, you can email me too. We can have a virtual coffee, chat about science and careers.
We have another question.
Oh, yay.
Concentration or like the fluctuation of the CO2 levels affect the ocean ability to hold heat.
So do the changes in CO2 concentrations in the oceans affect how much, or their heat capacity?
So the heat capacity of the ocean affects the CO2 concentration. So the opposite of what you're asking. So as our oceans warm, the oceans just in terms of solubility aren't able to absorb gases as effectively. So we're seeing that the oceans have served as this, they've done us a great service by absorbing atmospheric CO2 that we've been pumping into the atmosphere. Because the oceans have acted as a sponge and soaked up that CO2, it's greatly reduced kind of the climate change that we've been feeling on land. But that ocean sink has a capacity, and that capacity is declining because of warming. So if you kind of think of, if you leave a soda out on the table, or a glass of water even, you can see bubbles begin to form as it sits there for longer and longer because it's warming up and gases are being released from your water, from your soda or whatever. And so the oceans can't hold as much CO2. And also, we didn't talk about this today, but the chemistry of how ocean acidification is progressing also is altering what we call the buffering capacity of the ocean. So also its capability of taking up CO2 as well. So we won't be able to depend on it quite as much in the future. It's becoming a smaller and smaller sink. Not super dramatically, but it's definitely changing.
Makes sense. Warmer waters hold fewer gases.
That was a super long answer to a wonderful and simple question. Sorry.
Any questions from the people on Zoom? I see some names there.
How's Miami?
It's cooling off. The weather has finally broken, so that's nice. It's like 70s and maybe low 80s every day, which was a welcome change. I'm missing the fall weather of the north.
Good. All right. I think we're all set. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'm sure our students, if they have any other questions, they'll get in contact with you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, Emily.
Bye.
Thank you. I'll stop the recording now.
I am.
Oh, you got it.